Hello again, everyone. This is Johnny back with another video, and today I wanted to talk about a sport that I've actually been a fan of for quite some time, and that is the UFC. I've been a fan of mixed martial arts in general for a very long time. I think the first martial arts thing, anything with martial arts related, I saw was actually Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. And though the UFC is certainly not choreographed fighting, it did spur my interest in the sport in general. Of course, even before the UFC became popular, I was a fan with Pride, but then the UFC became all the rage, and now that's where a lot of people actually go view some of the best mixed martial arts fights. With that being said, though, what I wanted to do today was actually talk about what I feel are the 7 greatest UFC upsets of all time. There's been a ton of fights in the UFC and a ton of upsets, so I think I picked a pretty good list of 7 fights that were like, what just happened when it happened? So I'm going to actually start off with this upset, and it's the first fight that we saw between Kamaru Usman and Leon Lewis. So after hearing, what people say, especially after the first upset happened, that this might have been the greatest UFC upset in history. And I think that's kind of a lot of recency bias when it comes to that. So I don't see it as like the greatest UFC upset. But I guess I'll look at it this way. The reason why I don't see it as the greatest is, for starters, even though Usman was the favorite in the fight and was winning the fight actually at the time of him getting knocked out, Leon Lewis did come into that first fight with a decent win streak himself. Plus, he has also fought and lost to Usman before, which, gives him a leg up on a rematch because it is harder to defeat an opponent a second time when you actually fight them. Yes, no one saw that one coming, but I just think there are other fights that were more of a shocking upset than this one. I know, some might say this is me actually caping up for Kamaru Usman, since if you've actually listened to some of my UFC shows I've done on my podcast, that he is my current favorite fighter, which, can be understandable. But as we go through this list, you will see that even though this fight here actually made the list as one of the greatest upsets, it's certainly not the greatest of all time, but it certainly does belong on the list. Let's move on to the next upset, and this one, in hindsight, might not look like a huge upset, but at the time it happened, it was actually very shocking. So the BJ Penn versus Frankie Edgar fight fits this billing. At the time, BJ Penn was regarded as one of the greatest UFC fighters in history already, having won 2 titles in 2 different weight classes, and looked pretty unstoppable in the light heavyweight division after coming down from welterweight. And then this young kid with a lot of energy in Frankie Edgar shows up and puts on a masterclass of boxing, and even took BJ Penn down actually a couple of times in that first fight. No one, and I mean no one, saw this coming, and in the dominant fashion that it did actually for Frankie in the fight. Now, Frankie is an all-time great, but having said that, his title win over BJ is definitely one of the most shocking upsets ever. Let's actually go to the next one on my list. And anytime a GOAT gets choked out, it has to automatically make the list. And when Amanda Nunes got beat by Juliana Pena, and the way it happened, I bet you that no one, including Juliana's own camp, wasn't actually, picking her to win that match, and certainly in that fashion. I mean, she did pull up though, and did it pretty impressively in my opinion. I know she lost the very next time she actually fought Amanda. So her title reign wasn't long, which is why I believe it actually deserves to actually be on the list. Side note, I think actually Juliana might be one of the best women fighters currently in the UFC, actually not named Amanda Nunes, but we'll just have to see how, her future holds and what she continues to do in her fight career. Let's go on to my next UFC upset, and this one, much like the one between Amanda and Juliana, has a similar feel to it, even though at the time GSP wasn't considered a GOAT yet. Having said that, this one came out of the blue to the immortal Matt Serra, and it is still one of the most shocking losses in UFC history, and the way it happened too. So Matt was well known for his Brazilian jiu-jitsu and submission game early on in his career. So no one thought Matt would be able to do anything to GSP, considering he was better at those things than he was. But Matt came with the thunder in his hands that night and knocked GSP out to win by TKO. Granted, the very next fight in the rematch, GSP gave him that business, so Matt's time on top was pretty short-lived. What made this fight for me a bigger upset than the one I mentioned between Amanda and Juliana, just in case anybody is wondering, is if you actually look at Juliana and Matt respectively, if you actually go head to head with their, careers, I'm going to say that Juliana is way better fighter than Matt was at that time in his career. And if you look at it, Matt's record at the time was only 11-7, while Juliana is 16-5 overall at the time she fought Amanda. So yeah, I think I'm going to go with Juliana to actually be the better fighter. She also has an outside chance at the Hall of Fame one day, where no one was ever saying that about Matt. So that's why I actually have the Serra over GSP fight ranked higher, at least for me anyway, in my opinion. Let's move on though to the next fight on my list, and I think everyone knew this one was going to be on the list, and I know since this fight people has judged Ronda Rousey differently now that that she actually is out of the sport and got mopped up a couple times. But at the time when she took that L to Holly Holmes, it could have been considered the greatest UFC upset in history, and here's why. At the time, Ronda was argued to be the greatest woman fighter in the world and really had dominated every opponent she faced, beating them with her patented armbar move. Now, everyone in the MMA community knew that Holly had skill, but the overwhelming majority of people thought that much like how Ronda beat everyone else, the same would be for Holly. And then the fight started, and from the opening bell, you could see the large gaps between Holly, the natural striker, and Ronda, who didn't have a good stand-up game, which allowed her to get caught with that devastating head kick that happened, I believe, in the second round, and that was all she wrote. I believe this fight deserves to be this high on the greatest UFC upsets. The next fight on my list was even more shocking than this one, if you can believe it, because it involved one of the GOATs, and there was and kind of still is a case to be made for Jose Aldo being ranked number 2 behind John Jones ever, because anyone with 2 eyes can see that he's the overall GOAT of the sport, in spite of the fact that he had, some octagon shenanigans. I'm speaking of John Jones, that is, being the undisputed GOAT. And he's kicking butt in heavyweight right now. But anyway, Aldo, much like the aforementioned Rousey, had dominated everybody. And to make this crystal clear, it wasn't even close. Leading into that fight with Conor, everyone thought Aldo would walk right through him. And the fact that Aldo really didn't like Conor at all, we thought that would bode well for him. Welp, it didn't, and he got knocked out in 8 seconds into the fight, since I'm sure that aggression that he had at this point worked against him. I do know that Conor at the time was on a very good win streak himself, but Aldo was the whole package when it came to fighting. Up to that point, he didn't have many holes in his game. That's what made this fight so shocking. At the time, arguably the GOAT of the sport got knocked out in 8 seconds by a guy who only really had one go-to thing in his fight bag, and it still didn't matter. Jose Aldo is still one of the greatest fighters to ever do it, but he is going to have to take this 2 spot for that L, since it is one of the greatest UFC upsets in history. I really wanted to put this fight number 1, but then I remembered this fight and was like, oh yeah, that one's number 1 for sure. So let's talk about the number 1 greatest UFC upset. In my opinion, I think this easily takes the cake. For me, Anderson Silva versus Chris Weidman, the first fight. So let's start with the fact that going into the fight, Anderson had the record for the most title defenses in UFC history, a mark that he actually still holds to this day. He had just come off a fight that saw him front kick Vitor Belfort to the face and knocked him out. So surely this up and coming kid who was not and still isn't well known by a lot of people outside of the MMA community had zero chance to actually beat Anderson, right? Well, technically that was right until Anderson started doing some of the same old playing around games, like, he isn't in the ring with someone that's actually trying to hurt him, and literally dropped his hands and stuck out his chin, and Chris connected, and that was it. Anderson was knocked out cold. I'm talking about plywood plank cold. I'm talking about ice cold. Dude was out, gone. It was the wildest thing I had ever seen in my life watching UFC and just honestly mixed martial arts in general. Even after that shocking loss, when we saw Anderson come back for the rematch, we all thought Anderson will go ahead and, stop playing around and give Chris that work. But nope. That didn't happen either, and it led to another shocking loss and painful looking, for Anderson. Now, Anderson Silva was the GOAT of the sport at the time, and for most people at the time, it wasn't even close. And of course, then this dude, Chris Weidman, just comes along and beat him. So yeah, that for me, that is my list. Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy the content you're listening to here, please like the video, subscribe to the page, and in the description, look for my podcast link that will take you straight to the All You Listen On podcast as well. Until the next video, I will talk to you all later. Peace.